Ethan Callahan occupied the top floors of a sleek glass building in the heart of Zurich. There, at the summit of the European corporate world, time seemed to move slower, as if every strategic decision carried the weight of a lifetime. At 38, he had achieved what most men didn't even dare to dream. Leading the international expansion of a tech giant, Ethan managed operations, negotiated with investors, and coordinated teams with the surgical precision of someone who not only understood systems, but also people, at least in the professional realm. His name was synonymous with efficiency, control, and results. Yet beneath the layers of tailored suits and the steady voice in meetings, there was a silence that was hard to decipher, a solitude carefully shaped between codes, algorithms, and performance reports. Zurich had given him what he needed at the most critical time in his life: distance. 3 years earlier, his wife had died suddenly, the victim of a brain aneurysm. The pain wasn't something he expressed. He didn't write mourning letters, didn't drown memories in bottles, nor scream in rage at fate. He simply shut down. He chose to move forward in the only way he knew, by working. That's how, just weeks after the funeral, he accepted the challenge to lead the company's new European headquarters, crossed the ocean with his young son in his arms, and began living as if every detail of the routine needed to be under absolute control. His apartment reflected that internal state. Too clean, too quiet, too functional. There were no paintings on the walls, no flowers on the balcony, no traces of childhood scattered across the floor. The only exception was his son's bedroom, which stood out from the rest of the home with overly organized toys, books lined up by color, and an old teddy bear. The boy hugged every night, as if that gesture protected him from everything he had experienced and still couldn't fully understand. Ethan loved his son, Liam, with a devotion that surpassed any rational boundary. Still, he struggled to show it in the way the boy needed. Grief had hardened his emotional language. Hugs were restrained, words measured, playfulness rare. He cared for his son with the efficiency of a manager, but tenderness slipped through his fingers like sand. He knew this, and he blamed himself. Liam was his only anchor in the world, the last true connection to something that couldn't be calculated or controlled by a spreadsheet. Sometimes, during sleepless nights, Ethan would find himself watching the boy sleep, trying to understand where he had lost himself as a man, as a father. He had promised himself that he would protect that small being from all the pain in the world. But how do you protect someone from the absence of your own affection? Ethan's rigidity wasn't arrogance. It was defense. Every cold gesture, every rational decision, every impassive glance at school parent meetings came from a man who had lost more than his wife. He lost himself in that hospital, when hope silently faded away. Since then, everything he built was an attempt to keep chaos outside. He locked himself into a meticulously planned routine, set schedules, balanced meals, non-negotiable meetings. There was no room for unpredictability, nor for disorganized emotions. Even vacations with Liam followed detailed itineraries, with scheduled times to sleep, wake, and visit tourist attractions. Still, guilt followed him like a shadow. He blamed himself for not laughing more with his son, for not knowing how to soothe the frequent nightmares that woke the boy crying, for looking into the child's face and seeing features of the woman he had loved and lost. Despite everything, Ethan wasn't insensitive. He just didn't know how to handle emotions anymore without falling apart. Deep down, he carried the desire to start over, even if he didn't know how, even if it meant confronting memories he had buried under layers of work and silence. He was aware that Liam needed more than material comfort, but he hadn't yet found a way to give his son what he himself had lost, a home with warmth and love. Deep down, he knew something had to change, but he couldn't allow himself to believe that anyone could break through the barriers he had built until the day Claire Bennett entered his life. Liam Callahan was a 4-year-old child who carried in his gentle gestures and deep eyes the mark of an absence he didn't yet fully understand. He had grown up under the protective care of a silent and efficient father, but he missed the warmth only a mother's presence could bring. Since arriving in Zurich, his life unfolded between the meticulously organized routine of the apartment and the monotonous afternoons at the international school, where he learned 3 languages and diligently drew blue trees and flying houses, perhaps in an unconscious attempt to bring color to a world that felt gray to him. Despite his early intelligence and heightened sensitivity, Liam was reserved, introspective, and often seemed to be in a distant place, watching the world with a stillness that didn't match his young age. He was a boy who understood silences more than words. He often spent long minutes staring out the living room window, where the snowy mountains shaped the horizon, or lay on the bedroom floor, lining up toy cars in perfect rows, as if each toy had a spot that couldn't be moved. His mother's absence didn't manifest in constant tears, but in small, empty gestures. He refused hugs from strangers, rarely smiled, and avoided prolonged eye contact. His eyes, however, said a lot. When he looked at his father, there was a mix of admiration and fear. Not fear of the man who raised him with such care, but fear of also losing the only remaining link to the childhood he once knew. Nights were particularly difficult. Liam didn't fall asleep easily. Even with bedtime stories, old recordings of his mother or books left on the nightstand, the nightmares returned like persistent shadows. He dreamed of empty hallways, doors closing on their own, voices vanishing into the dark. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and walk to the living room, where he'd sit silently on the couch holding his worn-out teddy bear, as if waiting for someone to notice he was missing. Most of the time, Ethan would find him there, carry him back to bed without saying much, tuck him in with his favorite blanket, and leave quietly, as if afraid to break what was already fragile. Liam was learning to live with that silence, but within him, a longing grew. For spontaneous affection, shared laughter, for someone who could see beyond his introspection. Despite everything, there was a living sweetness in Liam, even if hidden. When he felt safe, small joys would slip through. A muffled laugh when he saw a bird on the balcony, a sparkle in his eyes as he completed a puzzle on his own, an excited babble when he recognized a familiar song on the radio. These moments were rare, but they revealed the child who still existed beneath layers of silence and caution. Deep down, he wanted to connect, but he didn't know how. He hadn't developed tools to cope with loss, only adapted to it. And, like many little ones, he turned pain into silence, longing into resilience, love into quiet hope. His interaction with other children was limited. At school, he kept his distance, observed more than he participated. The teachers spoke to Ethan about his above-average intelligence, but also warned about his difficulty in forming bonds with classmates. Liam seemed to live in a bubble of caution, where everything was measured before it was felt, and that worried his father, even if he didn't know how to do things differently. He had hired the best professionals, psychologists and educators, but none of them had managed to break through the invisible wall Liam had built. It was as if the boy had accepted, with unsettling maturity, that the world offered no guarantees, and for that reason, any new bond might mean a new loss. The apartment they lived in offered safety, comfort, and beauty, but lacked warmth, and Liam, even without knowing how to name what he felt, sensed it in every corner. The coldness of the furniture, the absence of laughter in the hallways, the silent lunches with a view of the Alps, all of it kept alive the feeling that he and his father were merely surviving. Still, even in that restrained environment, the boy held on to a spark of hope. Something inside him seemed to wait for someone who could fill the empty spaces, not with promises or grand gestures, but with presence. Someone who knew how to sit beside him without rushing, who understood his silences, who wasn't frightened by his introspection. That presence, though still distant, had begun to take shape on the horizon. And although Liam didn't yet know it, the arrival of Claire Bennett would change everything, not just because of her background in child psychology or her gentle demeanor, but because of something much simpler. She would truly see him, without hurry, without judgment. And for the first time since losing his mother, Liam would begin to feel that he could trust someone outside the narrow circle that surrounded him. Before he even realized it, he would start to open up, not with words, but with gestures, a hand reaching out, a toy shared, a look that said, "Stay," and little by little, something would begin to blossom, not only in him, but throughout the entire environment around him. Claire Bennett's presence began to change the Callahan routine even before any of them realized it. Her arrival wasn't marked by major events or impactful gestures, but by subtle transformations, almost imperceptible at first. The private nanny agency that Ethan had carefully selected recommended her after a rigorous screening process. Claire's resume was solid, but it was her quiet and sensitive way of understanding the world of children that ultimately influenced the decision. And even without clearly expressing it, Ethan sensed something different about her, something discreet, yet deeply comforting. And Liam, who so often shut down around new faces, didn't pull away. He simply observed her for several seconds, as if recognizing, without understanding why, a familiarity that couldn't be explained with words. Claire had left the United States months earlier, in a move that was part escape, part search. Her last year in Boston had been marked by emotional exhaustion, sleepless nights, and a string of decisions that drained her energy. With a degree in child psychology and a specialization in early childhood emotional development, she had worked for nearly 6 years in demanding clinics and schools, where she dealt with complex cases, conflicted families, and expectations that weighed heavily on her shoulders. A relationship that once promised stability had turned into a deep disappointment, undermining her confidence and pushing her into a silent breakdown. When she realized she could no longer keep up the same pace, she chose to change continents, not just to breathe new air, but to find herself again. In Zurich, she found the unexpected. The clean, organized, and quiet city stood in stark contrast to the emotional chaos she still carried. Even so, little by little, she began to rebuild her routine with gentleness. Her new role as a private nanny offered something the clinics and schools no longer did: intimate, human contact with just one child at a time. It allowed her to give full attention and, at the same time, avoid being consumed by endless demands. Her gentle and observant nature, her ability to respect another's emotional pace, became her greatest strengths. Even though her wounds were still open, Claire didn't let them get in the way of her mission to care. She understood, more than most, that simply being present was often the greatest act of love. The Callahan apartment was the first place where Claire felt a strange sense of familiarity. There was a cold beauty, a rigid order, and a silent atmosphere that, in some way, also reflected parts of herself. She quickly realized that Liam wasn't just a reserved boy, but a small universe filled with layers. She didn't try to invade his space. She simply made herself available. She sat on the floor while he lined up his toy cars, offered books without insisting on reading, shared silence without seeming uncomfortable. Slowly, and without fanfare, Liam began to accept her presence, first with curious glances, then with small gestures, letting her sit beside him, pushing a toy in her direction, holding the hem of her shirt when something scared him. Claire didn't force bonds. She built them with the care of someone who understood the weight loss can have on a small heart. She saw in the boy's eyes the absence of his mother, but also something more, a deep longing for emotional safety, for someone who not only cared, but stayed. And though she knew she could never replace his mother, she also knew she could be a bridge between what he had lost and what he could still gain. In return, Liam began to open small windows into his silent soul, offering moments that meant everything to Claire. A muffled laugh during playtime, a hand reaching for hers before crossing the street, a contented whisper before falling asleep. And with each small step forward, Claire understood she was, little by little, rediscovering her purpose. Even with all the care she dedicated to Liam, Claire couldn't help but notice the rigidity with which Ethan managed his own pain. The boy's father was an efficient, direct man, but emotionally restrained. Claire respected that space. She avoided intruding on his routine, but gradually began to notice the gestures that slipped through his control. How he adjusted Liam's blanket with an almost imperceptible tenderness. How he watched from a distance when his son approached her more naturally. There was no judgment in Claire, only understanding. She knew that wounded people, even adults, also needed time. And although she wasn't seeking intimacy with Ethan, she realized that their daily interactions were starting to create an atmosphere of mutual trust, something fragile, but real. Despite the calm she managed to build in the house, Claire still faced her own ghosts. At night, lying in her small guest room, she thought about the life she had left behind. The abandoned plans, the woman she no longer was, and the new version of herself she was still discovering. But there was something in Liam, and in the restrained atmosphere of that family, that made her want to stay, not out of obligation, but because of a kind of silent alignment. As if there, among predictable routines and restrained emotions, she could also begin to heal. And even without knowing what the future would bring, Claire began to understand that perhaps some connections happen not by chance, but out of a mutual need to start over. The apartment where Ethan, Liam, and now Claire lived was a faithful reflection of the patriarch's contained soul. The property, an elegant duplex in one of Zurich's most sought-after neighborhoods, stood with discreet grandeur, shaped by clean lines, open spaces, and large glass panels that provided a constant view of the snow-covered Alps in the distance. Every room seemed calculated with precision. Nothing clashed. Nothing stood out with extravagance. The furniture, all in neutral tones, occupied its place without disturbing the silence that dominated the environment. There was beauty there, but it was a cold, almost untouchable beauty. The polished marble reflected the natural light from the windows, without actually warming the interior. It was as if life was limited to the function of existing, without emotion, without noise, without color. On the lower floor, the main living room expanded into an open space, integrating the sitting area with a modern minimalist kitchen. Everything gleamed as if it had just been installed, but it lacked a human touch. The traces of affection that usually mark spaces inhabited by families in motion. No photographs, no crafts made by Liam, no detail that hinted at stories from the past. It was as if time inside that home had frozen on the day absence took over. Ethan's bedroom on the upper floor followed the same pattern. Clean walls, a perfectly made bed, heavy curtains that blocked out nearly all light. Everything suggested order, but it was an order born from the desire to control an inner chaos he had never admitted out loud. Liam's room, though slightly more colorful, still bore signs of that emotional restraint. There were toys, yes, but organized with an unusual rigidity for a child his age. Books remained aligned, building blocks stored in labeled boxes. The boy seemed to have absorbed the environment around him, suppressing his spontaneous nature to adapt to the house's silent logic. Claire noticed this in the first few days. Every step she took inside that space felt almost like a disruption. Her gentle movements, the way she placed objects softly, the words spoken in a low tone, all of it clashed, albeit gently, with the rigidity that reigned there. As the weeks went by, something subtle began to happen. Claire's presence, which didn't impose change but offered comfort, triggered small transformations in the apartment's atmosphere. Pillows that were once perfectly aligned began to show the imprint of Liam's body, as he now threw himself onto them more often. A child's drawing discreetly appeared pinned to the refrigerator door. A vase with simple flowers showed up on the living room console, brought by Claire during one of her outings with the boy. These were details that could go unnoticed, but together, they created a quiet contrast with the previous sobriety. And although Ethan didn't say anything, his eyes noticed each small change, not with irritation, but with a silent restlessness, as if he too were starting to realize that the world could be more than the silence surrounding him. At night, when the city sank into silence and snow gently accumulated on the glass balconies, Claire would lie in her guest room, feeling the weight and strangeness of inhabiting such an orderly place. But there was something comforting in realizing that, little by little, that cold space was starting to transform, not into something noisy or chaotic, but into a place that breathed again. The apartment, which once reflected only Ethan's grief and emotional distance, now carried subtle signs of an attempt at life. Liam, little by little, was freeing himself from the invisible restraints of the home. Claire, still grappling with her own emptiness, found steady ground there. And Ethan, even without admitting it, found himself facing a reality that no longer followed only his logic of survival. Deep down, that home, so impeccable and silent, was beginning to give way to something new. And this transition, though slow, carried within it the sign that even among cold walls and wide windows, human warmth could still find space to bloom, not by imposition, but by mutual need. As if every corner of the house had been silently waiting for the exact moment when life would, at last, begin to pulse naturally again. Even with her experience, Claire felt the emotional impact of living under that roof. The boy's sadness didn't express itself in tantrums or tears, but in prolonged silences, in gazes that seemed tied to memories he couldn't yet name. It was an emptiness she knew well, though in a different form. Her own recent past still weighed on her shoulders, and maybe that's why it was possible to establish a silent bond with Liam before any concrete connection was made. The empathy that linked them didn't come from words, but from a similar pain, still alive, still raw, that they were both trying to reinterpret. Ethan, for his part, kept his distance. He fulfilled his role as a father, present at scheduled times, attentive to Liam's school and medical commitments, but unable to break through the emotional barrier that separated him from the child. Claire didn't judge him. She simply observed, and deep down, she understood that within him lived a kind of frozen grief, a loss he had never fully allowed himself to collapse under, perhaps out of fear of not being able to rebuild what might come after. As the weeks went by, the relationship between Claire and Liam began to take clearer shape. Even though the boy resisted displays of affection, he started allowing closeness. He accepted her hand when crossing the street. He smiled faintly when she encouraged him to complete a puzzle. He stayed by her side on the couch during a night of heavy rain, his eyes fixed on a picture book she read aloud in a soft voice. Small gestures, almost imperceptible, but to Claire, they meant the beginning of something vital, the rebuilding of trust. She knew from experience that in homes marked by deep loss, bonds formed differently. They were fragile at first, but when built with truth, they could become unbreakable. And so, in the controlled routine of that apartment, under the shadow of the Alps, and the silent watch of a father who observed everything without interfering, Claire took her place, not just as a professional, but as someone capable of gradually translating what no words could explain. The home, still marked by absence, began to respond to presence. And in that delicate, silent, and respectful coexistence, something began to take shape, like a piece finally fitting where there once was an empty space, gently filling what time and pain had left suspended. Even with Claire's constant presence and the subtle transformation she was bringing to Liam's days, Ethan remained wrapped in an invisible wall, built over months in which silence had served as his only refuge. The way he moved through the rooms of the house, always with firm steps, an impassive gaze, and controlled breathing, made it clear that his relationship with routine was not about preference, but about survival. He continued managing everything with precision, delegating tasks efficiently, reviewing work reports between rushed coffees and solitary dinners. Claire picked up on this without having to pry. Her trained eye could see the rigidity behind Ethan's self-control. He didn't disrespect anyone, never raised his voice, and showed no impatience toward his son or her. But it was clear that the way he related to his environment and those around him came from a place where emotions had fully retreated. Even during the rare interactions between him and Claire, usually limited to updates on Liam's routine or specific requests, there was a formality that was hard to break. He listened attentively, responded with sparse words, thanked her when he deemed it appropriate, but offered no space for any connection beyond function. Claire, respecting that boundary, never pushed for a closer relationship. She limited herself to maintaining her work with the same quiet dedication she showed with Liam, knowing that any premature attempt could only lead to further distance. But even without meaning to, she observed the man who inhabited that house with growing curiosity, not out of vanity, nor loneliness, but because of the way he managed to remain so composed in the face of everything. It was as if his pain had crystallized into a structure he refused to dismantle. Ethan seemed to live like someone who had already decided not to expect anything more from his emotional life. The loss of his wife still shaped everything around him, not only in memories or physical absences, but especially in the way he avoided any contact that might reopen that wound. He treated emotions like dangerous territory, a place not to be stepped on. And so, even with Claire's constant presence and the small but visible improvements in Liam's behavior, Ethan remained untouched. His cold demeanor wasn't hostile, but it revealed a continuous effort not to allow any vulnerability. He observed from a distance the positive effects of the new routine on his son's life, but he never said a word about it. He just watched, silently, and pulled back whenever he sensed he might be drawn into the atmosphere of renewal that was slowly settling into his own home. At night, when the house had fallen asleep and silence settled into every room, Ethan remained awake for hours. He scrolled through reports on his tablet, reviewed spreadsheets, or simply stared out the window into the emptiness of the snow-covered mountains. At times his eyes would drift off, and his still body seemed to ask for rest that his mind wouldn't allow. The bedroom still held Lauren's absence, Liam's mother, Not only in the clothes Ethan had boxed up right after the funeral, but in the details he never managed to undo. The armchair where she used to read, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the closet's upholstery, the way the morning light hit the wall, just as it did on the days she still breathed beside him. Ethan wasn't a man of sentimental rituals, but he hadn't been able to completely erase the traces of a love that had defined him for years. That's why his coldness didn't stem from indifference, but from denial, as if admitting the presence of something new. Any spark of change meant betraying what he had been forced to leave behind. For Claire, the challenge wasn't Ethan. She hadn't come there to understand or change that man. Her focus was Liam. Yet, as the days went by, it became impossible not to notice how the father's presence, even distant, directly impacted the boy's emotional state. Liam missed not only his mother, but the presence of a father who, though physically there, kept his heart locked away in some hidden chamber. And that reflected in the boy's insecurities, in the moments when he regressed, in the silences that returned stronger after a week of progress. Claire realized that for Liam to truly thrive, her careful presence wouldn't be enough. The surrounding environment needed to give in, and in that, Ethan was the most unyielding pillar. There were days when change felt tangible. Liam laughed more easily, sought Claire out on his own, made little comments about drawings, animals, or memories of his mother, things that had once seemed unreachable. But all it took was a chance encounter with Ethan in the hallway, a sterner look, or his silent withdrawal during a moment of affection between Claire and the boy, for everything to take a few steps back. It was as if Ethan, even unintentionally, imposed a limit on his son's emotional progress. Claire, always observant, didn't interfere. She knew the process was slow. She also knew that Ethan's ice wouldn't melt with obvious gestures. He was a wounded man, not a cruel one. And perhaps that's why, even as he kept his distance, there was something in him that stirred not pity in her, but understanding, not sympathy, but patience. Life in that apartment moved to this delicate rhythm, where three people shared the same space, each confronting their own ghosts, their own losses, their own ways of surviving. Claire stayed firm in her purpose. Liam began to take his first steps back toward reconnection with the world, and Ethan, though externally motionless, was beginning, even unknowingly, to be affected by a presence that demanded nothing, yet offered everything in silence. The coldness of his posture, no matter how steady it appeared, was beginning to show small cracks, invisible to the untrained eye, but obvious to someone who knew where to look. Ethan's rigidity extended, even more sensitively, to Liam's behavior. Although the boy was only 5, he carried a heaviness in his eyes that didn't match his age. There was something in him that wavered between apathy and fear, a kind of emotional block that kept him distant, even from the simplest gestures of affection. At first, Claire faced this invisible wall with the serenity of someone who already understood the paths of childhood grief. She didn't force closeness, didn't try to win him over with promises or artificial enthusiasm. She simply showed up, every day, in the small routines, at the set times, with consistent actions. That was how she built the bridge that would later become essential for Liam to open himself back up to the world. In the beginning, Liam avoided her gaze. When Claire approached, he would shrink back, turn his face, shift his body. He accepted the food, but didn't engage. He tolerated her presence in his room but kept his toys locked away in a box, untouched, as if they were relics from a childhood frozen in time. Claire, noticing this behavior, acted with surgical care. She kept her voice soft, her movements gentle, and never crossed the boundaries the boy set with his silences. Instead of seeking immediate contact, she observed how he reacted to certain colors, which sounds made him withdraw, which objects sparked a faint glow in his eyes. Every detail served as a clue to understand the safest path toward him. And so, day by day, she adjusted her approach to create a space where Liam could feel he didn't need to stay on guard. Over the first week, even without apparent progress, Claire remained steady. She continued preparing Liam's favorite meals, even if he didn't show excitement. She kept sitting on the rug in the living room, stacking colorful blocks he never touched, but that she arranged with the same care as someone building real castles. She continued reading children's books in a quiet voice, even though the boy stayed turned away, slowly flipping through the pages of his own silence. And it was in that constant, almost invisible process that something began to shift. First came a brief glance, then a quiet approach during playtime, and then a small gesture, a toy piece left beside her, as if testing a new boundary. These signs, nearly imperceptible, meant far more than simple childhood responses. They were the manifestations of a heart that, little by little, was stepping out of hiding. Claire understood that it wasn't just about earning trust, but about offering safety, the kind stable enough that Liam would feel he wouldn't lose everything again. Her presence didn't need to be intense, but consistent, not overly cheerful, but genuine, and that was exactly what she gave. Liam began watching her more closely, imitating some of her small gestures, like how she folded a blanket, or how she arranged colored pencils by shade. And then came the clearer signs: a short question about an animal from a book, a quiet giggle at a cartoon, a nap on the couch as she rocked him with the sound of an old lullaby. What Claire offered wasn't just technical care. She offered presence, and Liam, even still buried beneath layers of pain, began to recognize in her something he hadn't seen since losing his mother. Someone who didn't give up, who stayed even when he resisted, who welcomed even silence with tenderness. Mornings, once marked by tension and withdrawal, began to take on new tones. Liam no longer hid when she entered the room. He accepted help getting dressed, allowed her to guide him to the breakfast table, and even let her brush his hair without tears filling his eyes. Little by little, resistance gave way to a shy but promising coexistence, and what stood out most was how Claire never celebrated those milestones with exaggeration. She respected his pace, as if she knew each small gesture was a seed that would still take time to fully bloom. Meanwhile, Ethan remained at a distance, attentive but uninvolved. From behind his rigid routines, he observed how his son had started to open up, and although he didn't show it, he saw in Claire something he himself couldn't offer. Even while remaining cold, a kind of silent admiration began to emerge, not for who she was as a caregiver, but for the way she understood the landscape of pain without invading it. He recognized that there was something in her that couldn't be taught in training or courses. It was something born from experience, from true empathy, from the instinct of someone who knows that healing is, above all, about waiting. That realization, though unspoken, marked the beginning of a subtle shift in Ethan, not in his outward demeanor, but in how he began to see her. And so, day after day, the silent apartment with its cold walls and large windows began to pulse with a different energy. Nothing happened suddenly. There were no dramatic revelations or intense moments. Instead, it was a slow and continuous process of transformation, where three people, each in their own way, began to adjust to each other's presence. Claire didn't just earn Liam's trust. She rescued him from a dark place, with patience and affection. And in doing so, she also touched the invisible structure that held Ethan up, forcing him, even without meaning to realize that time, when respected, could still heal what pain once froze. The process of building a connection between Claire and Liam had required delicacy, consistency, and a kind of sensitivity you don't find in manuals. But now, with the first bonds already planted, she was able to move on to something even more transformative, returning to the boy what grief had erased: color, art, and sound. As much as he was used to the apartment's neutrality, its white walls, cool-toned furniture, and lack of childlike objects, Claire could see that behind that sterile appearance, there was fertile ground waiting to bloom. It wasn't about forcing distractions, but about reigniting senses that had been silenced. And as always, she began with the details, slowly, but with intention. She introduced color gradually. She started by leaving illustrated books on the living room table, with vibrant covers that caught the eye even in passing. Then, she began to swap out small decorative items for more playful, colorful ones. A turquoise pillow on the couch, a small vase of yellow flowers on the counter, a paper mobile hanging near the window. These weren't abrupt changes, but organic transformations that filled the space without forcing it. Liam, at first, just watched. His eyes passed over the new additions with the curiosity of someone who couldn't quite remember what it felt like to see such bright colors. But little by little, he stopped avoiding them. He sat near the books, touched the pillows, carefully studied the spinning mobiles when the wind made them twirl. Over time, Claire started involving Liam in simple but meaningful activities. She brought boxes of colored pencils, crayons, and non-toxic paints. She laid out a large tarp on the floor, and gently invited him to explore the textures, tones, and shapes. Liam was slow to join in. For the first few days, he only watched as she drew by herself. Claire drew animals, trees, waves, clouds. She colored with patience and left the drawings within his reach without pressuring him. Until one afternoon, he picked up a crayon and drew a curved line. He didn't say anything, didn't look at her, but stayed beside her. And she, recognizing the miracle in silence, simply smiled inwardly and continued drawing beside him. The once silent space also began to fill with sound. Claire believed in the power of music to access blocked emotions. She introduced calm melodies in the mornings, filling the apartment with soft instrumental tracks, gentle piano harmonies, and nature sounds blended with delicate strings. At first, Liam just listened from afar, but eventually, he began to follow the rhythm with tiny foot movements. He tapped his toes on the floor, subtly nodded his head. Claire took this as a sign and brought in children's instruments, colorful xylophones, soft drums, little maracas. She didn't ask him to play them, just left them on the rug among the toys. And one day, Liam tried them out. He made a timid sound with the xylophone, then another, then a sequence. She never interrupted the process with words or over-the-top encouragement. She simply offered presence and steady stimulation, allowing him to lead his own awakening. Beyond art and music, Claire also reintroduced movement. She noticed that Liam's body still carried tension, withdrawn postures. So, she began dancing gently through the house, letting him see how she transformed the space with lightness. Sometimes she spun alone in the living room, arms wide, eyes closed, as if dancing for herself. And Liam, curious, started to watch her with fascination. One morning, as she danced to an instrumental waltz, he approached and spun on his own feet. It was a clumsy, shy twirl, but it was a step. Claire didn't react with exaggerated joy. She kept dancing and let him join that new world in his own time. Gradually, he began to look forward to that moment each day, as if the dance were a bridge between what he feared and what he longed to rediscover. The change in Liam's behavior became visible even to Ethan, despite his cold demeanor. He passed through the common areas and noticed the paint marks on scattered papers, the musical instruments out of place, the boys' quiet laughter amid the soft sounds. He didn't comment, didn't show surprise, but he watched. In his usual rigidity, something began to soften, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant. He saw his son smile faintly for the first time in months. He realized that Claire had achieved what doctors, therapists, and specialists had not. She didn't heal with formulas. She healed with presence. And in that process, Ethan was confronted with a truth that left him unsettled. The fact that someone from outside had managed to rebuild a part of the world he, with all his resources and intentions, had been unable to touch. Over time, the spaces in the house became more alive. Mornings were no longer silent. The hallways, once cold, began to carry the scent of paint, the sound of laughter, and light footsteps. Liam now moved with more freedom, explored the rooms, called out to Claire with spontaneous gestures and signals. Art didn't just return color to his daily life, it returned expression. Music didn't just break the silence, it returned rhythm. And dance wasn't just a game, it was the way he found to feel part of the world again. Claire, attentive to every nuance, maintained her usual care, never rushing, never crossing the limits Liam still guarded, but continuing, day after day, to build this new safe territory where childhood could blossom again, even after being suspended for so long. The transformation Claire had initiated in Liam, through art, music, and silent affection, began to reflect not only in the boys' actions, but in the very space they lived in. The apartment, once marked by cold tones and oppressive silence, began to mirror the new energy that, discreetly and steadily, was taking hold of their routine. What had once been purely functional and soulless now bloomed with life, as if each of Claire's caring gestures left visible roots in the environment. The neutrality of the walls no longer intimidated. The smooth surfaces, once so expressionless, now welcomed touches that softened the edges of pain. Without fanfare, Claire modified each room with the same respect she showed when handling Liam's emotions. The living room, once still as a showroom, now held elements that suggested movement and warmth. The once empty shelves were filled with picture books, playful objects, and small wooden sculptures. A soft rug replaced the previous cold, industrial one, and on it began to spread building blocks, sheets with unfinished drawings, and neatly arranged fabric toys. The curtains, which once blocked sunlight, were replaced with lighter fabrics that allowed the gentle morning light to pour in freely. The brightness changed how time was perceived in that home. The day no longer felt stagnant. It unfolded. In the kitchen, where metallic surfaces and an almost clinical rigidity had once prevailed, traces of coziness appeared. Claire began preparing small snacks in fun shapes, using animal molds, delicately cut fruits, and contrasting colors on the plate. Liam still held some hesitation around food, but the visual appeal of these details intrigued him. He sat at the table more often, watched her gestures, and more readily accepted foods he once refused. It was as if the now warmer environment helped unlock his emotional openness. Even the air felt lighter. Liam's bedroom became the clearest reflection of change. Claire transformed the space with the care of someone planting a garden in damaged soil. She added elements that nurtured imagination: planet stickers on the walls, a moon-shaped lamp, a fabric tent where he could retreat. The wardrobe, once filled with rigidly aligned clothes, now mixed colorful pieces, socks with childlike prints, and soft pajamas. Claire also added a corkboard, where, day after day, she pinned Liam's drawings, even the most abstract ones, even the loose scribbles. Every one of his creations found a place there, as a symbol of achievement and expression. And Liam, realizing that his marks had value, began creating more, experimenting, inventing characters, shapes, and visual stories. The bathroom, which had once exuded an almost impersonal distance, now held charming little touches. Claire placed a step stool next to the sink, so Liam could reach the faucet on his own. She replaced the towels with versions printed with animals, placed a fun cup for rinsing, and added toys to bath time. Each change had a purpose: to restore autonomy, spark joy, and soften the rigidity that had settled into the space since silence took hold there. And over time, Liam began to feel more at ease. Even in those intimate moments of self-care, he no longer resisted as much. He accepted bath time more calmly, allowed Claire to wrap him in a towel, to brush his hair with gentle strokes. Even Ethan's room, though he hadn't directly contributed to any of the changes, subtly reflected the influence of this new chapter. A book left by Claire on the side table, a picture frame with an old photo of Liam that she had found tucked away, a throw blanket placed over the armchair. These weren't invasive intrusions, but gestures that showed she cared not only for the child, she cared for the whole space, like someone watering a house so it could breathe again. And although Ethan didn't comment or show any immediate reaction, he allowed each of these items to remain. He didn't move them, didn't reject them. His silent acceptance was, in itself, a form of acknowledgement. As the days went by, even the sound in the apartment changed. The echo of solitary footsteps was replaced by soft melodies, scattered laughter, and toys being dragged across the floor. The living room clock no longer dictated time with the same coldness as before. Now, time seemed to flow according to Liam's emotional rhythm. There were more introspective days when he preferred to paint in silence, and there were days when he danced through the living room, barefoot, arms raised, celebrating something he himself couldn't name. Claire followed these rhythms attentively, without imposing structure, allowing each phase to unfold naturally. The most important thing was that he felt safe to be who he was, in his own time, in the space that now embraced him. This transformation also began to reflect in the invisible energy that filled the rooms. The visiting professionals, therapists, social workers, noticed the change and discreetly commented on the positive impact Claire had brought. The apartment, once described as a cold and disconnected environment, was now seen as a living, pulsating space that actively contributed to the child's emotional recovery. Claire, however, wasn't seeking praise. Her motivation came from empathy, from silent listening, from the sensitivity of someone who understands the importance of details. And this rare and genuine posture was the seed that allowed every corner of that house to bloom with new life. The apartment's transformation continued its quiet course, directly affecting the dynamic between Claire and Liam and inevitably reaching Ethan as well, even if he tried to resist. At first, he limited himself to observing from a distance, remaining inside the armor he had built over the years. But the more the days passed, the more he realized that something beyond his control was starting to seep into his own routine. The barriers he believed to be impenetrable began to crack, not by force, but by the steady subtlety of the small gestures filling the house. Ethan had grown used to discreetly following Claire's movements through the apartment. From the moment she arrived, with her light, confident steps, to the delicate interactions with Liam, each scene seemed to stir in him an unfamiliar discomfort, something far beyond the control he valued so highly. He was surprised by the way she occupied the space, not intrusively, but as someone who offers presence, who understands that simply being there is a form of care. He noticed how she reorganized not just the physical environment, but also the flow of the house itself, filling with color and life what once seemed immobile. What intrigued him most was realizing that, where he saw limitations, she saw possibilities. Where he saw walls, she built bridges, and that unsettled him. Ethan found himself, time and again, unintentionally listening to her soft voice guiding Liam through simple activities, like putting together puzzles or picking music to listen to. He noticed his son, once trapped in a cocoon of isolation and silence, beginning to respond, to seek connection, to offer small bits of trust that had once seemed unreachable. And that, somehow, forced Ethan to revisit his own emotional boundaries, something he never imagined he'd have to face. Ethan tried, in vain, to rationalize what was happening inside him. He told himself this change was part of the process, that Claire's presence was professional, that all of it was simply a natural consequence of the work she was doing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that, because it wasn't only her gestures toward Liam that affected him, it was the details that, involuntarily, defied logic. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she focused on a task, the way she smiled, even when she thought no one was watching, the almost instinctive care with which she noticed needs, not only Liam's, but the spaces, the energies that flowed there, and without him being able to stop it, each of those little moments began to inhabit places within him that he had kept protected for so long. No matter how much he tried to keep his emotional distance, his gaze was drawn, day after day, to that point of light Claire seemed to represent in a world that had lived in darkness for far too long. He began to find excuses to be nearby. He found trivial reasons to walk through the rooms where she was, checking a document, grabbing a coffee, replying to an email that could easily have been answered from his office. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the tasks moving him. It was her. It was the effect her presence had on him, and that threw him off balance. The discomfort didn't stem only from the realization of what she stirred in him, but from the internal battle it unleashed. Because even as the attraction grew, his mind tried desperately to rebuild its walls. The pain he carried, the losses, the disappointments, the fear of getting involved, of allowing himself to feel again, all of it came crashing down like an avalanche, trying to smother any chance of surrendering to what was silently beginning to grow inside him. It was as if every one of her steps through the house reverberated in a part of him he thought was locked away, inaccessible. He noticed his own habits changing, almost without realizing it. His work hours became shorter. He no longer locked himself in his office until late at night, as he once did. He allowed himself to be more present at home, even if he told himself it was to monitor Liam's progress. He started to notice his breathing changed whenever he crossed paths with her in the hallway. That his heartbeat sped up when, by chance, he saw Claire sitting on the living room rug, organizing toys with Liam, while softly singing a song he didn't know, but one that now seemed to be part of the house's soundtrack. Ethan tried, and failed, to ignore the feelings. He tried to stay guarded, as he had for so long, but even in the moments when he retreated to his own room, he realized that silence no longer brought the comfort it once did. On the contrary, it was in that silence that the most dangerous thoughts gained strength. He began to think more often about the day she arrived, the way her eyes met his, the impression he had in that instant that their meeting would change more than he was willing to admit. He fought against himself, against the growing desire to give in, against the urge to get closer, to understand who this woman really was, this woman who had so unexpectedly broken through his defenses. But the more he resisted, the more he realized the battle was uneven, because even without trying, even without knowing, Claire was occupying spaces that no one else had reached in years, and the worst, or the best, depending on the perspective, was that she did it without asking for anything, without expecting anything in return. It was simply her presence, her essence, that stirred that silent earthquake inside him. Little by little, Ethan realized that the distance he tried to maintain no longer made sense, because even if physical space still separated them, his thoughts kept crossing that line, again and again, like someone ignoring all the warning signs. And though he still refused to admit it, something inside him already knew that this story, which had started as a simple professional arrangement, could never be reduced to that. Because, without meaning to, without even realizing it, Claire had become much more than his son's nanny. She was already, in some way, a fundamental part of that home, and, inevitably, part of him too. As the days went on, it became inevitable that the connection between those three lives would begin to intertwine on increasingly deeper levels, far beyond the simple routine imposed by shared living. What had once been limited to discreet glances and subtle presences now manifested in small, almost trivial moments, charged with emotional tension that neither Ethan nor Claire fully knew how to manage. These were episodes that, from the outside, might have gone unnoticed. But for those within that story, they held the weight of true internal upheavals, capable of reshaping certainties and tearing down defenses that had once seemed unbreakable. The first of these moments happened on an unexpected evening, when a light, steady rain made any outdoor plans impossible. The house, which had once maintained its habitual silence, now seemed to welcome a different atmosphere, almost complicit, as if it too were part of the quiet narrative unfolding among them. Claire, with her natural spontaneity, noticed there were enough ingredients in the pantry and, without drawing attention, decided to prepare something simple, yet comforting. Liam, who now accepted her presence with more sweetness, helped in his own way, filling the space with smiles and laughter, bringing life to a place that had long been immersed in monotony. Ethan, holed up in his office pretending to be busy with spreadsheets and reports, couldn't resist the smell that began to spread through the house, a mix of fresh herbs, warm bread, and a sweet note he couldn't quite place, but which somehow pulled him out of his emotional fortress. As he stepped through the kitchen door, his eyes fell on a scene so simple it hit him with unexpected force. Claire, sleeves rolled up, stirring something in a pot, while Liam sat on a stool watching her every move with calm curiosity. Her light laughter blended with the sound of silverware, creating a soundtrack that, in that moment, belonged to a real home, not just a house with cold walls. Without exchanging many words, the three ended up sharing that improvised dinner. The table, once used almost exclusively by Ethan in solitude, now seemed to take on a new meaning. The candles Claire found tucked away in a cabinet helped warm not only the room, but also something invisible hovering between them. Each bite, each exchanged glance, each gesture built an invisible bridge that connected their hearts, even as both tried, in some way, to ignore what it all represented. And in that moment, even though none of them admitted it, something inside each of them knew that this dinner carried far more weight than any they had known before. In the days that followed, other moments continued to strengthen that quiet bond. One occurred on a Sunday morning, when Claire suggested going for a light walk. Without it feeling planned, they ended up at a park on the shores of Lake Zurich. The sky was clear, and the landscape reflected on the water, as if the entire scene conspired in favor of that moment. Liam, gripping Claire's hand tightly, ran through the grass, kicked dry leaves, and watched the boats slowly crossing the lake. Ethan, always maintaining an air of detachment, walked a few steps behind, watching with a mix of wonder and unease, as if witnessing his own resistance slowly crumble. Their pace slowed as the walk went on, and without realizing it, they ended up sitting on a bench facing the lake. The silence that settled no longer carried the uncomfortable weight it once did. On the contrary, it was now a comfortable silence, full of meaning, where words were unnecessary. Liam's laughter filled the air, and every now and then, Ethan's eyes met Claire's, creating an invisible current, one that made hearts race, that took the breath away, that made both of them realize this simple walk had the power to change everything. But it was on one particularly tense night that this connection reached a new level. Liam, who had been showing clear signs of emotional progress, woke up feeling unwell, his body hot, his face paler than usual. Claire, who had naturally assumed the role of caregiver from the beginning, immediately sensed something was wrong. Without hesitation, She took charge, administering the proper medication, monitoring his temperature, and staying alert for any changes that might signal a need for specialized care. Ethan, even as he fought against his own instincts, couldn't keep his distance. He spent the night pacing from room to room, pretending to check emails or review contracts, when in truth, what kept him awake was the inability to ignore what was happening. Through the crack in the door, he watched Claire sitting beside Liam's bed, holding his small hand and softly humming a lullaby, trying to soothe the boy and ease his discomfort. The scene, though simple, hit Ethan with crushing emotional weight. For the first time in a long while, he realized he was no longer alone in a mission he had believed to be solely his. The hours ticked on through the early morning, and even as the fever began to subside, Claire remained steadfast, refusing to leave the side of the little boy who had, by now, become a part of her as well. And it was there, in that space between physical exhaustion and emotional weariness, that Ethan felt, irreversibly, that his defenses were crumbling for good. What had once seemed like mere suppressed attraction, a discomfort caused by proximity, now revealed itself as something much greater, far more complex, and above all, far more dangerous, because it involved not just desire, not just emotional hunger, but a vulnerability he had spent years trying to deny. He realized it was no longer possible to pretend Claire was just a temporary professional, someone who was there to fulfill a practical role in the household routine. She had come to represent much more than that. She was now an essential part of a daily life that, not long ago, had seemed doomed to emptiness. And as he watched that woman, exhausted yet tireless, care for his son with a love that overflowed from every gesture, Ethan understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was completely lost, not in the sense of not knowing where he was going, but in the sense of having finally found something he never imagined he would feel again. Claire, who until then had been entirely devoted to young Liam and attentive to the emotional fragilities he carried, began to show signs of change. She could no longer hide her distracted glances, the moments when she withdrew in silence, holding her phone with trembling hands, her eyes losing the light glow that had begun to bloom since entering the lives of that family marked by grief and loss. In the intervals when Liam was asleep, and the apartment once again dipped into brief bubbles of silence, she would distance herself, walking out to the balcony or taking refuge in some corner of the living room, where she would stare at messages that seemed to strip away fragments of her newly restored peace. The sender of those messages was none other than the most painful part of her past, the very one that had driven her across the ocean in search of a fresh start. Her ex-fiancé, a man whose charming appearance masked a skilled manipulator, had broken months of silence to try to regain the control he lost when she made the hardest decision of her life, to run. The words, though wrapped in promises of regret and change, carried between the lines the same old emotional pressure, the psychological games she knew too well, games that had sickened her mind, her body, and her ability to trust in love. At first, Claire tried to ignore it, to pretend it didn't affect her, that she could simply delete each notification as if she were also deleting each reopened wound. But it wasn't that simple. Her body reacted. Her breath quickened, her chest tightened, and her thoughts spiraled into a chaotic storm. And as much as she tried to hide it, Ethan, with his ever-watchful gaze, masked behind an air of indifference, noticed. His eyes, trained to detect detail, a skill honed by years in the corporate world, quickly picked up the signs. All it took was a lingering glance, a tightened expression, and he understood something was slipping out of Claire's emotional grasp. At first, Ethan tried to convince himself it wasn't his concern, that the relationship they had built was professional, and that any involvement beyond that crossed a line he himself had drawn, a line he believed was uncrossable, ever since life had cruelly taken the woman he loved and left him with Liam as both a legacy of love and sorrow. But the problem was that, even as he clung to the cold distance that protected him, his gaze kept being drawn to her. And the discomfort he felt when he saw the look of fragility on her face was stronger than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just concern for his son's nanny. It was something that began to break through the walls he had built around his own heart, something that had been growing, subtly, since the day she first walked through that door, bringing not only her suitcase but a different energy, one that filled voids he hadn't even realized existed. Seeing Claire shaken, visibly distressed, awakened in him an instinct he believed had long been lost, the urge to protect. Liam, who had until then been the gravitational center of that transformation, seemed to sense, even in his innocence, the shift in the atmosphere. The boy, once more open, smiling, and connected to the present, began to look at Claire with a mix of concern and confusion, as if sensing that something threatened the stability they had only recently begun to build. Even without understanding the source of that invisible tension, he could feel that the woman who had offered him hugs, stories, songs, and laughter now seemed, on the inside, just as broken as he had once felt during those long months after losing his mother. As the days went on, the messages intensified. They no longer carried only promises and supposed regrets. Gradually, the tone shifted. Demands came, attempts at guilt, veiled threats that might have seemed harmless in written words, but she knew all too well the weight they carried, and it began to affect the daily routine. Claire became more distracted, started making small mistakes, forgetting where she'd placed something or losing track of time during activities with Liam. Though she tried to hide it, Ethan saw it. He watched from a distance, masking his awareness while pretending to be absorbed in meetings, contracts, and numbers spinning across his desk. But the truth was, his focus was split, even against his will. Ethan's physical presence, though still mostly from the shadows, no longer felt indifferent. He began to show up in the details. A cup of tea left purposefully on the corner of the table where Claire liked to sit, a blanket neatly arranged on the couch when he noticed she'd fallen asleep there after a long afternoon with Liam. Simple, quiet acts that said more than any words. Words, both of them, out of pride, fear, or self-protection, insisted on not speaking. No matter how hard he tried to fight it, Ethan couldn't ignore how deeply it affected him. The control he had always maintained over his emotions began to crack, like slow-forming fractures in a structure he believed to be unshakable. And the more he watched Claire trying, unsuccessfully, to hold up her crumbling world, the stronger the almost primal need to intervene became. Not because she was his employee, not because her presence was essential only for Liam's well-being, but because, inevitably, she was already part of something even he couldn't name, something that, day after day, was growing stronger inside him. While all of this was happening, the apartment, which months ago had reflected only silence and absence, now carried a different kind of tension. It was no longer emptiness. It was the presence of repressed feelings, unspoken desires, fears that kept them apart, but at the same time, pushed them toward each other in ways neither of them could, or wanted to, completely control. And even without realizing it, life was once again testing the walls they had both built, challenging them to understand that no matter how much the past hurt, the present was insistently offering a new chance to begin again. While Claire tried to silently cope with the shadows of her past that continued to haunt her peace, a completely different kind of conflict stirred within Ethan, growing in proportions he could no longer ignore. It was as if, while watching Claire's every move, each hidden fragility, each loving gesture she showed Liam, a part of him was fiercely fighting against himself, against something that was beginning to grow without permission, without planning, beyond the control of his rational mind. But along with this emerging feeling came a crushing guilt that seeped into every thought, every breath, making him silently question whether he had any right to feel anything beyond grief, no matter how much his gaze sought Claire, no matter how his heart raced every time he sensed her presence in the room. There was a voice inside him whispering relentlessly that loving another woman would be an unforgivable betrayal to his wife's memory, the woman who was gone, leaving behind not only the pain of loss, but also the immense responsibility of caring for Liam and preserving a legacy of love that now seemed to conflict with everything stirring inside him. It was as if his mind had split into two completely opposing worlds. On one side, the vivid memory of the woman who once meant everything. On the other, the pulsing present, full of nuances, unexpected affections, and a life that insisted on blooming through Claire's presence. Ethan began to isolate himself more and more within his own emotional maze. When he wasn't busy with work, he would retreat to his office, pretending that reports, contracts, and spreadsheets could fill the void that refused to close. But not even the weight of responsibility was enough to numb the storm of emotions that consumed him. All it took was hearing, in the distance, Liam's laughter mixed with Claire's gentle voice filling the house, for a wave of conflicting emotions to crash into his chest. It warmed him, but it also hurt. He longed to be a part of that moment, yet something inside him froze, as if crossing the line between protection and involvement would be a betrayal of the life he once built with his wife. This guilt didn't stem only from sorrow or longing. It came from promises made in the silence of mourning, from internal vows he had taken in the darkest moment of his life, when he swore he would never allow another woman to occupy the space that belonged to the one who had passed. But now, with Claire present, offering not just care to Liam, but also unexpectedly filling voids Ethan didn't even know existed, those promises began to crumble, and it tore him apart in ways he couldn't even explain. Each time their eyes met, even unintentionally, Ethan was overwhelmed by a suffocating mix of desire, fear, and guilt. His mind kept dragging him back to the past, to the smiles, the conversations, the plans he and his wife had made that fate had so cruelly taken from them. But at the same time, the reality of the present knocked unrelentingly at his door, showing him that life in some way moved on, that even without wanting to, even without planning, it found ways to bloom again, to rebuild, to fill the empty spaces with new colors, new sounds, new emotions. This duality began to show in his behavior. On one hand, he became increasingly present in the household routine, finding excuses to be in the same rooms as Claire and Liam. He observed from a distance, offered small gestures of care, tried to somehow be a part of the world he had once avoided. But on the other hand, he pulled back the moment he realized he was giving in too much. He would raise his emotional walls again, lock himself in his office, become unnecessarily curt, as if trying at all costs to remind himself that he couldn't, shouldn't, didn't have the right to feel what he was feeling. And this internal struggle kept growing stronger. The simple act of hearing Claire humming while preparing a snack for Liam, or seeing her sitting on the living room rug with scattered books, telling stories that made the boy's eyes light up, was enough to trigger an almost unbearable conflict inside him. There was a growing desire to be part of that, to allow himself to live it, but also a devastating pain, a suffocating feeling that by doing so, he'd be erasing the memory of the woman he once loved so deeply. Ethan found himself trapped in a cycle that seemed endless. The more he tried to pull away, the more drawn in he felt. The more he convinced himself he needed to keep his distance, the more he realized that his gaze, his attention, and most of all, his heart no longer obeyed him. And amid all of this, there was also the weight of responsibility. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not just for his own sake, but especially for Liam, who had already lost so much and was now slowly beginning to find an emotional stability that once seemed impossible. Time, which once seemed frozen, now moved in strange ways. The days blended together, full of small gestures, shared silences, glances that said far more than any words. But even though nothing was said aloud, there was a lingering tension in the air, a silent expectation of just how far this might go. Claire, still dealing with her own ghosts, tried to stay grounded, even as she noticed something in Ethan's behavior growing increasingly ambiguous. Liam, meanwhile, remained immersed in the purity of childhood, absorbing, without fully understanding, the subtle changes in the atmosphere of their home. While all of this was happening, the apartment, which months ago had reflected only silence and absence, now carried a different kind of tension. It was no longer emptiness. It was the presence of repressed feelings, unspoken desires, fears that kept them apart, but at the same time, pushed them toward each other in ways neither of them could, or wanted to, completely control. And even without realizing it, life was once again testing the walls they had both built, challenging them to understand that no matter how much the past hurt, the present was insistently offering a new chance to begin again. While Claire tried to silently cope with the shadows of her past that continued to haunt her peace, a completely different kind of conflict stirred within Ethan, growing in proportions he could no longer ignore. It was as if, while watching Claire's every move, each hidden fragility, each loving gesture she showed Liam, a part of him was fiercely fighting against himself, against something that was beginning to grow without permission, without planning, beyond the control of his rational mind. But along with this emerging feeling came a crushing guilt that seeped into every thought, every breath, making him silently question whether he had any right to feel anything beyond grief. No matter how much his gaze sought Claire, No matter how his heart raced every time he sensed her presence in the room, there was a voice inside him whispering, relentlessly, that loving another woman would be an unforgivable betrayal to his wife's memory. The woman who was gone, leaving behind not only the pain of loss, but also the immense responsibility of caring for Liam and preserving a legacy of love that now seemed to conflict with everything stirring inside him. It was as if his mind had split into two completely opposing worlds. On one side, the vivid memory of the woman who once meant everything. On the other, the pulsing present, full of nuances, unexpected affections, and a life that insisted on blooming through Claire's presence. Ethan began to isolate himself more and more within his own emotional maze. When he wasn't busy with work, he would retreat to his office, pretending that reports, contracts, and spreadsheets could fill the void that refused to close. But not even the weight of responsibility was enough to numb the storm of emotions that consumed him. All it took was hearing, in the distance, Liam's laughter mixed with Claire's gentle voice filling the house, for a wave of conflicting emotions to crash into his chest. It warmed him, but it also hurt. He longed to be a part of that moment, yet something inside him froze, as if crossing the line between protection and involvement would be a betrayal of the life he once built with his wife. This guilt didn't stem only from sorrow or longing. It came from promises made in the silence of mourning, from internal vows he had taken in the darkest moment of his life, when he swore he would never allow another woman to occupy the space that belonged to the one who had passed. But now, with Claire present, offering not just care to Liam, but also unexpectedly filling voids Ethan didn't even know existed, those promises began to crumble, and it tore him apart in ways he couldn't even explain. Each time their eyes met, even unintentionally, Ethan was overwhelmed by a suffocating mix of desire, fear, and guilt. His mind kept dragging him back to the past, to the smiles, the conversations, the plans he and his wife had made that fate had so cruelly taken from them. But at the same time, the reality of the present knocked unrelentingly at his door, showing him that life, in some way, moved on, that even without wanting to, even without planning, it found ways to bloom again, to rebuild, to fill the empty spaces with new colors, new sounds, new emotions. This duality began to show in his behavior. On one hand, he became increasingly present in the household routine, finding excuses to be in the same rooms as Claire and Liam. He observed from a distance, offered small gestures of care, tried to somehow be a part of the world he had once avoided. But on the other hand, he pulled back the moment he realized he was giving in too much. He would raise his emotional walls again, lock himself in his office, become unnecessarily curt, as if trying, at all costs, to remind himself that he couldn't, shouldn't, didn't have the right to feel what he was feeling. And this internal struggle kept growing stronger. The simple act of hearing Claire humming while preparing a snack for Liam, or seeing her sitting on the living room rug with scattered books, telling stories that made the boy's eyes light up, was enough to trigger an almost unbearable conflict inside him. There was a growing desire to be part of that, to allow himself to live it, but also a devastating pain, a suffocating feeling that by doing so, he'd be erasing the memory of the woman he once loved so deeply. Ethan found himself trapped in a cycle that seemed endless. The more he tried to pull away, the more drawn in he felt. The more he convinced himself he needed to keep his distance, the more he realized that his gaze, his attention, and most of all, his heart no longer obeyed him. And amid all of this, there was also the weight of responsibility. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not just for his own sake, but especially for Liam, who had already lost so much and was now slowly beginning to find an emotional stability that once seemed impossible. Time, which once seemed frozen, now moved in strange ways. The days blended together, full of small gestures, shared silences, glances that said far more than any words. But even though nothing was said aloud, there was a lingering tension in the air, a silent expectation of just how far this might go. Claire, still dealing with her own ghosts, tried to stay grounded, even as she noticed something in Ethan's behavior growing increasingly ambiguous. Liam, meanwhile, remained immersed in the purity of childhood, absorbing, without fully understanding, the subtle changes in the atmosphere of their home. And so, while Claire faced her past that kept trying to pull her back, Ethan found himself immersed in an even crueler internal battle, accepting that maybe life was offering him a second chance, a chance he had never sought, never imagined, and deep down, never believed he deserved. But no matter how much he fought it, ignoring that truth became more impossible with each passing day. After tense days, where Claire's past resurfaced to test her emotional strength, and Ethan fought in silence a brutal battle between guilt and the desire to allow himself to live again, an unexpected invitation came to break the routine, and, without them realizing it right away, became a turning point in the story they were unknowingly writing together. Ethan, who until then had maintained a rigid and controlled demeanor, surprised even himself when he decided that perhaps a short trip was necessary, not just for Liam, who deserved a break from the routine, but also because, deep down, he needed a breather. The tension building up inside him was about to spill over, and the house, as comfortable as it was starting to feel too small to contain everything he had been feeling. So, almost impulsively, he arranged a weekend in Lucerne, a city of near unreal beauty, where the lake mirrored the surrounding mountains and elegant architecture blended harmoniously with nature, creating a scene that felt like it came out of a dream. Upon arrival, the atmosphere changed immediately. The cleaner air, the silence broken only by the sound of water and birds, and the endless horizon brought a lightness none of them had felt in a long time. The hotel, away from the city center and surrounded by trails and woods, offered not only comfort, but also a kind of isolation that allowed each of them, in their own way, to reconnect with themselves. Liam, as expected, dove into discovering this new universe. His eyes lit up at the sight of the gardens, play areas, ducks swimming in the lake, and his laughter quickly filled the space, as if that renewed energy had the power to heal parts of him that were still wounded. Claire, in turn, even while carrying the recent scars from the messages that had tried to destabilize her, allowed herself, little by little, to breathe in that new environment. The contact with nature, the distance from pressure, and the chance to be present in the here and now made her, almost unconsciously, let down, if only temporarily, some of the walls she had built for protection. Her smiles became more spontaneous, her movements lighter, and her bond with Liam seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment, as if that setting, so different from their usual routine, offered a real chance for renewal. But it was between her and Ethan that the deepest change began to unfold. Away from the house's walls, away from daily obligations, away from the excuses they both used to maintain a safe distance, the feelings they had been carefully suppressing began to find space to surface. The exchanged glances, once discreet, became longer, more meaningful. The conversations, once almost exclusively centered around Liam or practical matters, naturally started to deepen, revealing parts of themselves that had remained hidden until then. Ethan allowed himself, for the first time in a long time, to look at Claire without the immediate weight of guilt. There was something about her that transcended any attempt at emotional control. Her presence, her lightness, her silent strength, everything about her seemed to speak directly to parts of him that had been dormant since the tragedy that marked his life. Watching Claire interact with Liam, seeing how she knelt to talk to him, made him laugh, held his hand with both strength and tenderness, awakened in him a devastating mix of admiration and desire, a desire he could no longer deny. No matter how hard he tried, there was no hiding the way his gaze would sometimes simply get lost in her. And Claire, who had also been battling her own fears, noticed. Every time Ethan's eyes met hers, she felt a mixture of safety and vulnerability that completely disarmed her. It was as if the man she had met wrapped in silence and grief now revealed a layer he himself didn't know existed, a layer made of care, of restrained desire, of a tenderness that escaped in small gestures, in unguarded words, in touches that, even when casual, carried an electricity too strong to ignore. The turning point came during a walk they took in the late afternoon. The sky, painted in shades of gold and orange, reflected on the lake as if each color had been hand-drawn for that exact moment. Liam ran a few meters ahead, mesmerized by every detail, giving Ethan and Claire a few minutes of closeness they rarely had in their usual routine. They walked side by side, and as the steps continued, the barriers slowly began to fall. There was a different tension in the air, not the uncomfortable kind from their early days, but one filled with desire, with possibilities, with a kind of anticipation that made their hearts race without a single word being spoken. Their eyes met once more, and in that instant, something inside them simply gave in. There was no need for words. It was a silent understanding, almost instinctive, that everything they had been feeling, and trying so hard to deny, was now impossible to contain. Ethan brought his hand to Claire's face, in a gesture that blended tenderness and urgency, and the touch of his fingers on her skin triggered an explosion of sensations that seemed capable of erasing, if only for a few moments, all the pain, all the fear, all the scars. The kiss that followed wasn't just the expression of repressed desire, it was the materialization of everything that had been silently building since the day Claire walked through his door. It was intense, charged with emotion, with surrender, with a near vital need neither of them had even known they possessed until that exact moment. And in that instant, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was no more pain, no more past, no more guilt. There was only the two of them, two hearts that after so much resistance finally allowed themselves to beat in unison. As they pulled away, their eyes remained locked, as if words were absolutely unnecessary in the face of the intensity of what had just happened. And even though no promises had been made, even though both knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges, there was something in that moment that was non-negotiable. The awareness that from that point on, nothing would be the same. What was born that weekend in Lucerne was more than a kiss, more than a meeting of bodies. It was the embodiment of a second chance that life, against all odds, insisted on offering. The following morning, after that emotionally charged sunset, something began to weigh on Claire. Reality, which had been softened by the beauty of the place and the intense connection that had blossomed between them, came rushing back in like a storm arriving without warning. As much as every gesture from Ethan, every look, every unspoken word made it clear that something deeply true was growing between them. Fear, an old familiar companion, quietly crept in. Memories of what she had lived through, of the scars left by a past that still echoed inside her, began to scream louder than her desire to allow herself to feel that emotion. Ethan, for his part, though he tried to maintain a composed demeanor, could no longer hide how his presence next to Claire was no longer just a rational choice. It was visceral. She had become part of his thoughts, his concerns, his desires, and in that fragile balance between wanting to protect her and simply wanting to surrender to what he felt, he found himself once again torn between his own emotional limitations and the urgent need to break down the walls that separated them. It was during another walk, different from the previous one, that they grew even closer. The scenery remained breathtaking. The lake's waters reflected the clear sky, the mountains painted a perfect frame on the horizon, and the soft sound of birds filled the silence between them, a silence now carrying much deeper meanings. Liam, occupied with other activities at the hotel, gave them that rare moment alone, where the masks fell almost without their noticing. As they walked, their steps slowed, their eyes met, and without needing to speak a single word, their bodies leaned toward each other, as if drawn by a force they could no longer control. The touch of their hands, until then discreet, became firmer, more certain, as if they both needed to confirm that this wasn't just in their heads, that it was real, tangible. And in the moment, Ethan brought his hand to Claire's face, caressing her with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity in his gaze. Time seemed to stop. The space between them quickly vanished, their faces so close that all it would take was a small movement, a brief breath, and their lips would finally meet. Claire's heart pounded uncontrollably, as if it might explode from her chest. Her breath shortened, and every fiber of her body seemed to ache for that touch, for that kiss that carried more than desire. It carried unspoken promises of care, surrender, of a new beginning she had never imagined possible. But it was precisely at that threshold, that second that separated desire from realization, that fear spoke louder, almost abruptly, overwhelmed by a mixture of panic and confusion. Claire pulled back. Her eyes, which had until then shown a mix of tenderness and longing, now reflected insecurity, doubt, and a kind of anguish she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't a lack of desire, nor rejection. It was the weight of the past, of scars that still burned inside her, of memories that, uninvited, rose to remind her that surrendering could once again mean getting hurt. Ethan, noticing her reaction, froze for a few seconds. The mix of surprise and frustration washed over him immediately, not from the rejection itself, but from the realization that even in wanting to protect her, he too was vulnerable. The invisible wall Claire erected the moment she stepped back seemed to materialize between them like a pane of glass, one through which they could see, admire, long for one another, but where the touch, the embrace, the kiss, all of it suddenly felt impossible. And though the moment had been brief, its impact reverberated like a silent shock that pierced them both deeply. Claire, visibly shaken, looked away, crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself from something she couldn't quite name, and took a deep breath, trying to regain the control that, for a few seconds, had completely slipped away. Inside her, a fierce battle unfolded. On one side, the nearly uncontrollable desire to fall into Ethan's arms, to live out the emotion that had been growing so powerfully. On the other, the visceral fear of repeating old patterns, of losing herself, of surrendering and once again ending up hurt. Ethan, even feeling the weight of her retreat, didn't take a step back. There was within him a blend of understanding and pain that, though conflicting, kept him there, present, whole, willing to respect her timing, even if that meant stifling his own emotions for a while longer. The way he looked at her, full of care, of respect, but also desire and a quiet frustration, made it clear that, despite that temporary setback, what existed between them wouldn't dissolve so easily. The walk back to the hotel, though silent, was charged with latent electricity, where every step seemed to echo what was left unsaid, what still hung in the air. Neither of them knew exactly how to break the silence, because any word in that moment felt insufficient, too small for the avalanche of feelings overflowing within them. As they approached the area where Liam was playing, the dynamic shifted. Almost instinctively, they resumed their roles. She, the loving and attentive caregiver. He, the present and watchful father. But no matter how hard they tried, there was no more pretending that nothing had happened. What was born in that almost kiss, and in the retreat that followed, changed their relationship irreversibly. From that moment on, every gesture, every look, every moment of closeness would carry the weight and beauty of the tension that had become undeniable, of the connection that, even interrupted, only grew stronger. And so, even with fear still present, even with the ghosts of the past once again trying to interfere, both Ethan and Claire knew, though unspoken, that from that moment on, what they felt could no longer be ignored, because some things, once awakened, simply cannot be put back to sleep. And even though the path ahead remained uncertain, one thing became clear to both of them. There was something there, something big, something real, something that, despite the fears, the traumas, and the missed chances, was worth living. The return to Zurich brought with it an almost imperceptible change in the air, as if something, though invisible, was about to drastically alter the course of Claire's days. The weekend in Lucerne had left deep marks, not only because of the emotions that had overflowed between her and Ethan, but also because, for the first time in a long while, Claire had truly felt what it meant to be alive. However, as often happens with those who carry scars, life sometimes insists on testing just how long that sense of lightness can be sustained. At first, returning to routine seemed to offer the sense of safety Claire so desperately needed. Taking care of Liam, following his activities, preparing meals, completing daily tasks around Ethan's house, all of it gave her a structure that, despite the responsibilities, also provided a kind of emotional stability she hadn't felt in a long time. However, it took only a few days for that sense of security to be violently shaken. A notification, so simple yet so unexpected, appeared on her phone, informing her that an international company, one with which her ex frequently did business, had launched temporary operations in Zurich and neighboring cities. And along with that message came the confirmation that made her heart freeze in her chest. He was there, in Europe. Not on the other side of the ocean, not somewhere far away, but close. Close enough that the past she'd been desperately trying to leave behind could cross her path once more. Panic gripped Claire instantly, and almost uncontrollably. Her body reacted before her mind could rationally process what it meant. Her hands began to tremble. Her breathing turned shallow, and for several minutes she simply couldn't move. It was as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet, and everything she had built until then, all the effort, all the courage, all the small victories she had fought so hard to earn in recent months, was about to collapse like a house of cards. The memories came like an avalanche, dragging with them every cruel word, every look filled with contempt, every gesture of humiliation her ex had inflicted on her in the past. And once again, the feeling of powerlessness, of fragility, of being at the mercy of a destructive force, returned to take up space inside her. In the following days, Claire tried, unsuccessfully, to convince herself that maybe it was just a coincidence, that he was only there for business, and that there would be no reason for their paths to cross. But no matter how hard she tried to cling to that fragile hope, her body betrayed her constantly. Any loud sound, any notification on her phone, any vaguely familiar face in the crowd was enough to trigger her state of alert. Anxiety became a constant companion, suffocating her from the inside out, robbing her of sleep, of peace, of her ability to concentrate. And though she tried to hide it from Ethan and Liam, her expression left no doubt that something was deeply wrong. It was then, in a desperate attempt to cling to some sense of normalcy, that Claire decided to return to one of the few habits she'd managed to maintain since arriving in Zurich. Her visits to the small cafe located a few blocks from Ethan's house. That space, with its wooden tables, shelves full of books, the aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread, had always been a refuge for her. A place where she could sit, take a deep breath, and for a few minutes, forget everything. And that day, more than ever, she needed just that. She needed that pause, that brief moment of internal silence where she could, if only for a while, reorganize her thoughts and try to regain the control that seemed to be slipping through her fingers. But what Claire never imagined, and perhaps couldn't even foresee in her worst nightmares, was that on that exact day, in that very cafe she considered one of her few safe spaces, her past would choose to reappear in a cruel and sudden way. She was sitting by the window, holding a cup of now lukewarm coffee, when she noticed a strange movement. First came that odd feeling, almost instinctive, that she was being watched. Her whole body tensed. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and a cold chill ran down her spine. And when her eyes slowly turned toward the door, the shock hit her like an electric current. There he was, standing, holding his phone, and staring straight at her, her ex. The same arrogant posture, the same look that once made her feel so small, so fragile, so powerless. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. The ambient noise faded, voices disappeared, and for a few seconds, all that existed was the presence of the man she had spent so long trying to forget. Her heart pounded, her hands began to sweat, and the only thing her mind could scream was the urgent need to get out, to vanish, to hide, but her body didn't respond. It stayed frozen, as if trapped in an invisible snare. What she didn't know, and only realized seconds later, was that at that very moment, Ethan was also there. He had decided shortly after to step out and take care of a few things, and, as he occasionally did, stopped by the same cafe to grab something. And the moment he walked in, his eyes immediately landed on Claire. But this time, something was wrong. Her expression wasn't the same. There was terror in her eyes, a fear so genuine, so raw, that anyone looking at her would know she was facing something that deeply threatened her emotional safety. And when his gaze followed the direction of hers, everything became clear in a matter of seconds. Ethan didn't need long to understand the situation. Claire's tense posture, the expression on the man's face standing in front of her, the heavy energy in the air, all of it painted a clear picture in his mind of what was happening. Without a second thought, driven by an instinct that blended protection, care, and a fury nearly impossible to control, he approached Claire with firm, confident steps, making it clear in every movement that she was no longer alone. His presence beside her immediately became a shield, an unbreakable barrier between Claire and that past that once again tried to invade her life. Ethan's body naturally positioned itself between her and the man, creating an invisible line that made it clear that from that moment on, any attempt to approach her would first have to go through him. His gaze, until then always filled with kindness when directed at Claire and Liam, now radiated a cutting coldness, a firmness bordering on threat. There was no need for raised voices or exaggerated gestures. Ethan's mere presence, his posture, his eyes, his silence laden with intent, was enough for anyone in that cafe to understand that Claire was no longer defenseless, that the man who had once hurt her so deeply no longer had the power to intimidate her. The impact of his intervention was immediate. Claire, who seconds before had been on the verge of collapse, felt, almost like a wave of warmth, the safety emanating from Ethan. Her trembling body began to calm. Her breathing found a more normal rhythm. And even though fear was still present, it now shared space with something she hadn't believed she could feel in a moment like that. Protection. The feeling of being safe, of not having to face her ghosts alone, of having someone who, without hesitation, stepped between her and any threat, stirred in her an emotion as intense as it was unexpected. The man, realizing Ethan's stance, hesitated. His initial arrogance gave way to visible discomfort. No matter how hard he tried to maintain an indifferent expression, his body betrayed his unease. His eyes, which had previously fixed on Claire with a need to dominate, now avoided Ethan's, darting away, searching for an exit from a situation that had clearly slipped from his control. And seeing that he would not have the stage he'd expected, that Claire was no longer the fragile woman he had once crushed with words and gestures, he simply retreated. He left the cafe in a hurry, like someone fleeing a scene that had suddenly turned into defeat. When the cafe door closed behind him, taking that shadow of the past with it, Claire realized her legs were still shaking, but at the same time, something inside her grew stronger, almost instantly, because in that moment, it became clear, not just to her, but to anyone who had witnessed the scene, that from that day forward, she would no longer carry the weight of her fears alone. That, against all odds, she had found someone willing not just to care for her, but to fight for her. And although not a single word was exchanged between them at that moment, both Claire and Ethan knew, deep in their hearts, that this episode marked a before and after in the relationship that had been growing and blossoming since Lucerne, and now, more than ever, was solidifying. The episode at the cafe, culminating in Ethan's protective intervention, left a deep mark on Claire's emotional journey. Even though the past had once again tried to invade her present, this time she wasn't alone, and that realization brought with it an intense mix of emotions, oscillating between gratitude, relief, tenderness, and a growing sense of security at Ethan's side. However, when the sharp emotions began to give way to the quiet hours that followed, Claire realized that, while she was externally protected, there were still internal wounds left open, some perhaps deeper than she had imagined. The return home after the incident was marked by a silence that, although full of meaning, also brought a certain serenity. Ethan, always attentive to unspoken signals, stayed close to her, offering his presence as a safe harbor without intruding on her inner world. And as much as his every gesture reaffirmed that she no longer had to face anything alone, Claire began to understand that there were battles no one else could fight for her. The presence of her ex, even if brief, had triggered something that brutally revealed how much she had been leaning on external structures: the safety of Ethan's home, the company of Liam, the routine she had built in Zurich, to try to silence internal pain that, in truth, had never really been addressed. That night, while the stillness of the house cradled the sleeping city outside, Claire found herself facing her own reflection in the mirror. And for the first time in a long while, she saw not only the woman trying to rebuild, but all the parts of herself that were still broken. And with that realization, a decision began to form inside her, first as a timid whisper, then as an unshakable certainty. She needed to pause, to breathe, to look inward, to confront, honestly and bravely, all the ghosts that still lived within her. And for that, she understood she needed to step away for a while, to return to her roots, to go back to the United States not as an escape, but as a journey to reconnect with herself, a deep, internal dive that could only be done away from her current surroundings, away from everything that, while comforting, had also begun to turn into a new kind of comfort zone. The decision wasn't easy. The idea of leaving Ethan and Liam gripped her chest with an almost suffocating tightness. After all, the connection they had built, especially after the days in Lucerne and the cafe incident, had become something far deeper than she could even describe. But precisely because she recognized the strength of that bond, Claire realized she couldn't allow it to become emotional dependency. She didn't want to love from a place of fragility, nor to build a story atop the rubble of unhealed wounds. She wanted to be whole. She wanted that, when she was ready to live this love in its fullness, it would come from a place of balance, strength, and emotional autonomy. When she finally shared this decision with Ethan, the tension was inevitable. The silence that settled between them at that moment seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. In his eyes, Claire could see a storm of emotions. There was surprise, there was pain, there was a real fear that this distance could somehow mean a permanent loss. But above all, what overflowed from Ethan's gaze was love. A love that, despite the fear, chose not to be selfish. He understood, in the deepest part of his being, that no matter how much it hurt, supporting Claire in that moment was the greatest act of love he could offer. And with a gesture that blended strength and tenderness, he encouraged her to take that path, not as someone letting go, but as someone holding on to an invisible thread that connected two souls destined to find each other again, no matter the time, no matter the distance. In the days leading up to her departure, the house took on a bittersweet atmosphere. Every shared routine, every meal, every glance, every gesture carried the weight of those who know that, for a while, it wouldn't happen again. Ethan, who had always maintained impeccable self-control, now allowed more vulnerability to show. His eyes, at times, revealed just how much that decision weighed on his chest. But even so, he remained steadfast in his determination not to turn that moment into yet another burden for Claire to carry. Liam, as intuitive as only children can be, also sensed that something was different. Although, protected by the sensitivity of the adults around him, he wasn't directly exposed to the reasons behind the imminent change. On the morning of the trip, Zurich's sky was filled with heavy clouds, as if the city itself, which had welcomed that chapter of Claire's life, also shared the weight of that temporary goodbye. The bags were packed, the tickets in hand, and every step Claire took toward the airport echoed in her chest with the force of someone leaving a piece of herself behind. Ethan accompanied her to the departure gate, staying by her side until the very last second, as if silently trying to memorize every feature, every expression, every detail he could carry with him during the time ahead. In the embrace that sealed their goodbye, no long words were needed. The silence between them said more than any speech could. In that moment, the entire world was reduced to that touch, that perfect fit of two bodies that, even as they were about to part physically, knew deep down they were more connected than ever. When the doors closed and Claire crossed the gate, taking with her not just her luggage but also all her hopes, fears, and desires, Ethan remained there for a few minutes, motionless, staring at the emptiness on the other side. His chest ached. It was true. Her absence already seemed to fill every space, but at the same time, he held an unshakable certainty within him. Sometimes loving someone means just that, allowing them to find their own path, even if it means not having them nearby for a while. As the plane climbed higher, cutting through the gray sky and disappearing into the clouds, Claire felt a powerful mix of emotions. There was sadness, longing, uncertainty, but above all there was a strength she never imagined she possessed, because in that exact moment, she realized she wasn't running away. On the contrary, she was, for the first time in many years, choosing herself, choosing to tend to her wounds, her pain, her dreams. And even if it meant pausing, temporarily, a story that had been growing and blooming so unexpectedly and intensely, she knew that if the love they built was real, then time, distance, and challenges wouldn't be enough to erase it. In that moment, as the clouds covered the city left behind, both Claire and Ethan, though physically apart, shared the same quiet certainty. This wasn't an end. It was just a new beginning. A necessary pause so that when the reunion came, it would be even stronger, more genuine, and more transformative. Because deep down, they both knew that some connections are so deep, so rare, and so precious that no matter the paths life insists on drawing, they always find a way back to each other. Always. 8 months had passed since that goodbye at the Zurich airport. Time, with its silent wisdom, had continued its course, carving out new paths, shaping new meanings, and above all, strengthening everything that once seemed too fragile to endure. In physical absence, both Claire and Ethan were led into deep inner journeys, which, though played out in different settings, shared a common essence: a reunion with themselves and the solidification of everything that truly mattered. And as the seasons changed, bringing and taking wind, leaves and colors, life, quietly and precisely, was preparing the stage for the next chapter of that story which, though marked by necessary pauses, never lost its continuity. And it was in this rhythm that Ethan's life found a new setting. After deeply reflecting on his own desires and what truly made sense, he made the calm decision to move to France, specifically to Bordeaux, where he found, in the countryside, a property that not only offered the peace he had been seeking, but also represented the chance to build a new home. A charming chateau, surrounded by vineyards stretching as far as the eye could see, became the place where he began to balance his professional life, now managed more remotely and selectively, with fatherhood, which had bloomed in his life in an intense, tender, and absolutely transformative way. Liam, in turn, adapted to the new routine with the lightness and spontaneity only children can express. His days, once shaped by the meticulous rhythm of city life, now danced to the beat of nature. Afternoons running through fields, endless discoveries among century-old trees, and a freedom he had never known. Under Ethan's attentive and loving gaze, Liam grew not only in height, but also in confidence, joy, and curiosity, becoming each day a living reflection of the love and care he now received unconditionally. During that time, though separated physically, the connection between Claire and Ethan never broke. There was something between them that transcended logic and circumstances, something that withstood silence, distance, and time. And even if they didn't exchange words every day, all it took was a glance at the sky at the same moment, a breeze blowing in the same direction, or simply closing their eyes for a few seconds to know, in their hearts, that they were still walking together, even if on parallel paths. Claire, for her part, dove into her own journey with a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Returning to the United States was not just a geographical move. It was a symbolic return to her origins, her dreams, to the parts of herself that had been stifled, forgotten, or neglected over the years. In that process, she rebuilt inner bridges, healed wounds she once thought incurable, and most of all, reconnected with the woman who had always lived inside her but had long been silenced by past pain. Through family reunions, new professional projects, and a deep dedication to her emotional development, Claire blossomed in a way that, if she could look back at herself 8 months earlier, she would barely recognize the woman now staring back in the mirror. And it was in that blossoming that she realized a truth that had always been there, silently pulsing inside her chest. As much as self-discovery, healing, and reconnection with herself had been essential, there was a part of her heart that simply no longer knew how to live, disconnected from the new life she had built. A life that, at its core, held not only Ethan's presence, but Liam's as well. Because deep down, what she had discovered was that love is not a choice between being whole alone or being happy with someone else. True love is born precisely when two whole people choose to walk together, not because they complete each other, but because they overflow into one another. It was then, moved by that understanding and the serene clarity that only time and distance can offer, that Claire made a decision that, unlike the one before, no longer came from a place of escape, fear, or insecurity. On the contrary, her decision this time was born from the purest conviction, from the deepest desire to build, to share, to live, to love. And without fanfare, without grand speeches, without theatrical promises, she set off for France, carrying with her not just her luggage, but also the quiet certainty that she was now ready to live everything life was so generously offering her. Her arrival in Bordeaux was quiet, almost poetic. The landscape unfolding before her eyes seemed like a dream, carefully crafted by invisible hands. The lush fields, the vineyards swaying gently in the wind, the stone buildings that held centuries of stories, and the sky painted in shades of blue and gold created a setting that was more than beautiful. It was deeply symbolic. It was as if that place somehow represented not just the new home of Ethan and Liam, but the point of convergence of all the choices, pains, healing, and love that had brought them there. Liam, with the contagious energy so natural to him, ran across the chateau's entrance as soon as he noticed the unusual movement. His small, hurried steps marking the beginning of something that, although he couldn't yet put into words, his young heart immediately recognized. His eyes sparkled with the purity of someone who sees beyond the obvious, beyond the immediate, and in his smile was a joy too big to contain, because deep down, Liam had always known, in the way that only children do, that the invisible bond that united them had never broken, not even during the months of physical absence. And then, there, at that exact moment when past, present, and future seemed to merge into a single point in time, Claire appeared. Wearing a shy yet completely genuine smile, her eyes reflected not only the emotion of the reunion, but also the serenity of someone who knows, with every fiber of her being, that she is exactly where she is meant to be. There were no more doubts, no more fears, no more suffocating questions. There was only the calm clarity of someone who understands that life, however unpredictable it may be, always finds a way to lead people to where their hearts belong. Ethan, who had been watching the scene from a few feet away, was overcome by a wave of emotion that defied any rational explanation. His body, his mind, his heart, every part of him recognized in that very moment that this reunion was not merely physical. It was, in truth, the materialization of everything they had built, even in absence, even in silence, even through distance. His steps, steady and certain, moved toward Claire, not as someone rushing to recover something lost, but as someone who acknowledges, with reverence and gratitude, the return of what had, in fact, never ceased to be his. The embrace that sealed that reunion was more than a physical gesture. It was a silent pact, a wordless declaration, a new beginning that needed no grand promises or eternal vows. Because deep down, both Claire and Ethan knew that the love between them was made precisely from the sum of everything they had lived. The pain, the pauses, the choices, the fears, the triumphs, and above all, the conscious decision that, from that moment on, they would walk side by side, not because they needed each other to be happy, but because together, life simply became lighter, sweeter, more beautiful. And it was with that serenity, that peaceful surrender, and that certainty pulsing in every cell, that Claire, looking at the man who had in so many ways become her home, and at the child who, without her even realizing it, had taken up an irreplaceable space in her heart, understood that she was finally ready not to begin something new, but to continue what life, silently and magically, had already begun to write from the very first moment they met. And so, in that setting where the wind danced between the vineyards and where love, now free from all the ties of the past, could finally bloom in its fullness, a new chapter began. Not as a period, but as a gentle comma separating the chapters of a story that, by its very nature, was always meant to be eternal. Because in the end, some stories aren't born to end. They're born to begin again, as many times as necessary, until love, in its purest form, finds its rightful place. And for Claire, Ethan, and Liam, that place finally had a name, an address, a shape, and more than anything, it had a heart.